try this.
All right, great. So welcome and thank you for attending the first part of our 4-part Safety Services webinar series. And today's topic is focused on Lockout Tagout. So my name is Chad DePasquale, and I am the Vice President of Services here at HESCO. The other 3 topics we'll be discussing over the next 3 months are arc flash safety, machine safety, and then ending with how to create a sustainable safety program. The dates and times of these webinars are shown in the bottom right of the screen, and you can sign up for any one or all these webinars at hesconet.com. Today, I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Nuala Mulla. Nuala is a business development lead for safety services at Rockwell Automation. She has over 10 years of experience helping customers deploy safety programs at their facilities across several industries, and is a Lockout Tagout subject matter expert for North America. Nuala will be hosting all 4 of our safety services webinars with the goal of taking a deep dive into program requirements, dissecting each requirement into understandable components, covering common pitfalls in program implementation, highlighting industry best practices, and then ending with simple starting steps illustrated by real case examples. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nuala.
Thanks, Chad. I am going to talk today through Lockout Tagout. That's the first part of this 4-part series. And we're going to focus on the key elements of a Lockout Tagout program, what goes into things like your policy, your machine-specific procedures, training, devices that you'll need, and then we'll talk annual audits, and then we'll talk at the end about how to kind of get your teams together to develop a program that is sustainable at your facility. If you have any questions, I believe you can chat them in, and Chad, if you see those come across the screen, just if you can interrupt me and shoot me the question, that'd be great, and I will do my best to answer everybody's questions on the call. So with that, we'll get started. There we go. So I'm just going to start here with a quick video, and the idea here is to just level set everybody on the importance of Lockout Tagout and what's at stake when Lockout Tagout is neglected.
This is the Bacardi bottling plant in Jacksonville, Florida. It's August 16th, 2012 at 4:30 p.m. What you're seeing here is a palletizer, a machine that packs and stacks cases of rum onto a pallet. The man you see here operates the palletizer. He's been cleaning the machine because bottles often break in the cases and the rum leaks on the conveyor belt, making it sticky. When this happens, the cases then crash into each other and bottles fall to the ground. This has been happening for a couple of years at Bacardi, and it hasn't been fixed. As the operator walks away, cases start coming down the line very quickly and crashing into each other. He hits the emergency stop button. Now, what's supposed to happen next is operators need to put a lock on the machine to prevent somebody from pushing the start button while someone else is inside. Under the machine, there's a lot of shattered glass as seen in these photos. There's also another emergency stop button and some bars that you can put underneath the platform to keep it from falling. But employees rarely did this for fear of slowing down production. The man in the orange vest is Dave Davis. He's a temp worker on his first day on any job in his entire life. In fact, his shift started just an hour and a half ago when he sent this photo to his fiancée. The operator points down below and tells Davis to sweep up the glass under the machine. Look at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You'll see Davis go underneath the palletizer to sweep up the glass. A few minutes later, Davis goes back upstairs to ask a question. The man in the white shirt, who's a supervisor, told police he had told Davis to sit by the side, but others heard him tell Davis to simply go get some gloves. Davis goes back downstairs underneath the machine. The supervisor and operator finish cleaning the conveyor rollers above Davis. They close the gate and turn on the machine. Cases come down the line, they're pushed into a square, and the platform goes down. Then they hear a yell. They see that Davis has been crushed by the machine. They hit the stop button. The palletizer operator is trying to manually raise the platform off Davis, but it's not working. The supervisor radios for someone to call 911. Here you'll see a worker pass down a pry bar to see if they can lift up the platform. There were some 60 cases weighing about 2,000 pounds on the platform when it went down. First responders got there within minutes, but it was already too late. The weight of the machine had killed Davis.
So when we talk about lockout tagout, the purpose of lockout tagout is to prevent the unexpected restart of equipment during any service that could harm employees. Lockout tagout is one of the top 10 citations yearly since it was introduced as a regulation in 1989. And in manufacturing environments, it's often the top cited OSHA violation. So when we look at the lockout tagout citations that were issued, and this is from Safety and Health magazine, this is from the fiscal year 2008. If we look at it, it's the fourth most cited violation section cited, excuse me. And the top sections cited here are actually having energy control procedures, training and communication, periodic inspection, those annual audits, and then having a program in place, and they have the appropriate sequence in place for actually shutting down the equipment. And so if we look back at the video that we showed from Bacardi, in this case, the employer failed to provide an adequate number of lockout devices to actually perform lockout procedures and to conduct a periodic review, right? So when we talk about those annual inspections of lockout procedures, and then they also failed to properly train their employees in methods and means for isolation. And when we talk about lockout tagout and making sure that people are doing that, the idea here really, right, according to the Assistant Secretary of Labor, is a worker's first day at work shouldn't be his last day on earth, right? So when we talk about lockout tagout policies and procedures, it's really important that we put together a program that is safe, sustainable, and that people will actually use, because the consequences of not doing so could be very serious. So when we talk about what we want to do when we put together a lockout tagout program, there are 5 components of any program. There's the corporate policy, there's machine-specific lockout procedures, employee training, locks and devices, and annual audits, which is that periodic inspection that people are talking about. And we're going to dive deep into each of these areas today, along with kind of how to get started in creating a program. So typically, and I think you saw it there in the list of citations for lockout tagout, there's some really typical challenges to creating and maintaining a lockout program. So developing procedures for all equipment, and we're going to spend some time there today because it does take, it's typically the part of lockout tagout that takes the most effort and bandwidth from your teams to put together and implement right. So developing procedures for all equipment is really a challenge. Auditing all of those procedures on an annual basis, making sure that employees are trained, so authorized employees being trained to perform lockout tagout, but also affected employees, making sure that they're trained to understand how to recognize that lockout, creating a policy and enforcing it, and then purchasing adequate locks and devices for your authorized employees to actually perform those lockouts. So we're going to start in lockout tagout procedures because it is typically one of the biggest challenges and also one of the hardest ones to get right. So before we dive into what goes into a lockout procedure, I'm going to talk about the 8 exemptions that you have to meet in order for a piece of equipment to not require one. And when we look at lockout procedures, right, or when we look at a piece of equipment, there's 8 key criteria, and failing to meet even one of those criteria means that you need to create a procedure for that piece of equipment. So no potential for stored or residual energy. The machine must only have one source. It can be completely deactivated by the isolation of that single source. It must be capable of being locked out during service. It can be isolated by using only one lockout device. The employee must be able to have the device under their exclusive control during service. The employee must be able to service the machine without creating additional hazards. And the company can have no prior accidents on the machine due to uncontrolled energy. So if we take a look at just a couple of those, we'll see why it's probably best to just have a procedure for all pieces of equipment. So if we look at the machine having only one energy source, that is a lot harder to come by than you might think. So a simple thing like a fan, you've got electrical for the fan, but then you've also got kinetic energy, right? You've got moving fan blades there. So something even that's really simple often doesn't, it may not pass that test of having that single energy source. The other thing that's really key here is number 8, and that's that you can have no prior accidents on the machine due to uncontrolled energy. And what happens here is, let's say you meet all of the criteria and you're not going to create a lockout policy. What happens is you're kind of in a constant state of evaluation on those pieces of equipment that don't have lockout procedures, because you have to be constantly evaluating whether or not they meet that eighth criteria, right? Has somebody been injured on this piece of equipment due to uncontrolled energy? And so most equipment in the neighborhood of 93 to 95+% of equipment is going to require a procedure because it fails to meet these other 7 criteria. And so for the extra, for the other 5%, right, to just kind of get you to 100% of your equipment having procedures, it might be worth it for you to do that so you can avoid kind of that constant evaluation on that 8th criteria. So now that we've walked through kind of a situation in which a piece of equipment wouldn't need a procedure, if the equipment does need a procedure, what does that procedure need to look like? So when we look at a lockout procedure, we've got a few required components. So we need to have a statement of the intended use of the procedure. So what's the purpose of this procedure? Methods for shutting down and controlling the hazardous energy, steps for the placement and removal of locks and devices, and ways to verify that that machine has been properly locked out. So in this procedure here, we have, as an example, we've got our device, right? So how we lock it out, where it is, the method that you use to lock it out, and then critically here, we also have this check step, right? So how is it that I know that I've properly isolated that source of energy for this particular piece of equipment? Procedures should also include information about the specific type of energy, and the magnitude of the energy, right? So if we look at here, and it's kind of hard to see, but we've got an electrical source here, and we also have the magnitude. In this case, it's 480 volts. We want to make sure that that information is included in the procedure. And when we look here, we've got 4 sources of lockable energy, but it's also really important that we include that there are non-lockable sources of energy on this piece of equipment. So we've got thermal energy and kinetic energy also. And so we want to make sure that both lockable and non-lockable sources of energy are called out in our procedures. So if we look at this, right, this is a piece of equipment, right? And so the question is, and really the whole intention of having procedures is, when I walk out to this piece of equipment and I need to perform some type of maintenance on it, how is it that I lock it out and that I have recognized all of the sources of energy that are on this piece of machine, and remember how to lock each one of them out and check and verify that I've actually isolated those sources of energy. If I'm just looking at the machine and I regularly service multiple pieces of equipment, it's hard to remember all of that information, right? And keep it all straight. And so the idea behind lockout procedures is that you have that information right at the point of use so that as you're locking out that piece of equipment, you know exactly what to do. So there are a few different types of procedure formats that can be used, and we'll talk through each of those, right? And what we're going to, these are all for that same piece of equipment, and we're going to assume for the purposes of this discussion that the information contained in all of the procedures is compliant. It's not. In some cases, it's missing some information, but just for the purposes of this discussion, we can go ahead and assume that these are compliant procedures, right? So in its simplest form, you know, these text-based check the box type procedures can be compliant provided they have all of the right information. So we've got the machine information here, we've got sources of energy checked off. In this case, we've even called out the magnitude here, any additional hazards that somebody would need to be aware of. And then we've got our shutdown steps and our restore to service steps. But if we think back to that piece of equipment, how helpful is this lockout procedure in helping me lock that piece of equipment out safely and efficiently? Now, in this text-based procedure, we've got a little bit more information. It's maybe organized a little bit better. We've got our purpose, policy, we've got our shutdown steps, our restore to service sequence, and then we've got some more information here about how to lock these out, right? So we've got electrical, we know where the location is, and we've got our methods. We're still, we talked about, you know, assuming that these are compliant. We're still missing our check steps here, but you know, this contains a little bit more information and it is a little bit better organized. It might be a little bit more helpful in helping you lock this out safely and efficiently. But what if we could do this a little bit better, right? What if we had pictures that could help the teams identify where those isolation points are, and what if we can match that up to all of this information? So now, if we're looking at a fully compliant procedure here, we've got our sources, right? So we've got our source IDs, we've got magnitudes, we've got the devices, the location, how it is you're supposed to lock it out, and then we've got our check steps. But what's really important here is that I can look at these pictures, and I've got something denoted here as E1, and I'm matching up that picture with what's in front of me. And then I have specific, you know, kind of color-coded steps here to help walk me through this lockout process. And so if we're looking side by side at the first one that we saw and the second one we saw, what is, you know, when you're looking at that, which do you think is the most helpful to have in front of your team so that they can safely and efficiently lock something out? And I would argue that, you know, having these pictures here as a best practice is really important in helping make sure that people are not only are locking out the right isolation point, which is really important for them to do that safely, but they can also more readily identify where those sources are so they can execute this task a little bit faster. This is kind of the last procedure that I'm going to walk through, and what we are looking at here is maybe a bit of information surplus. And I'm not suggesting here that none of the information on this page has no value, right? But we do have a lot of information, right? So instead of just this electrical information, we've got the electrical 480 fed from the MCC panel. We've got a very specific device. We've got a very specific location, method, and check step. And what that tends to do is, number one, it can make the procedure look cluttered. It can also, and in this case it does, it has a tendency to add pages to a procedure. So it feels very long and it's difficult to get through all of the information. But the other thing that it does is it also is a huge burden on the people creating those procedures to get all of this information to develop the procedures, right? So when we talk, and we'll talk about this later, but the bandwidth for developing procedures is quite high. And so the more information that you're adding beyond what is helpful in creating efficient procedures for execution, the more time you're going to have to spend in sort of that development stage. And so when you're looking at developing a program, it's really important to consider what information is both required for compliance, is a best practice for helping your authorized employees perform lockout tagout efficiently, and what's kind of a want, right? Because all of those extra wants when you're developing these procedures really do add in a lot of time when you're actually going to develop them. And depending on the size of your facility, that's really going to add up pretty quickly in terms of how long it's going to take you to develop procedures. So any questions, I'll pause here for any questions on procedure development or anything on kind of the procedure section that I laid out. Okay, so moving on to policy creation, right? So a policy has to have a few key elements in it, but it's got to have scope, purpose, and means of program enforcement, definitions and responsibilities, provisions for written procedures, employee training and annual inspection, and then instructions for special circumstances, right? So how are contractors and visitors handled from a lockout perspective? What are your policies around group lockout? What happens at shift change? And then what are your policies for lock removal? So if there is a situation in which an employee left the building left the facility for a day, or left and went on vacation, right? What are your policies around removing that lock when that machine is in a locked out condition? So those are the things that you're going to want to consider as you build that policy. And then you should regularly review that policy to make sure that it's still meeting the needs of your facility. Beyond that, right, so we talked about procedures, we talked about having the policies in place. The next big thing is employee training, right? So you have to have you should have training documented for authorized and affected employees, and it should be about those authorized employees should have training that includes recognizing hazardous energy sources, types of energy and magnitude, and then the methods and means for energy isolation and control, right? And you should kind of focus that training on those key things and how to use the procedures that are being used at your facility. And then affected employees shall be instructed in the purpose and use of energy control procedures. They understand what's going on when they see those in the facility. And then other employees whose work might be in an area where energy control procedures are utilized, right? Instructed about the procedure and about the prohibition of attempts to restart or re-energize machines which are already locked out, which are already locked and tagged out. Devices. So that's another key step in our lockout tagout program. Lockout tagout devices should be singularly identified, only be used for controlling energy and not for other purposes. And there's just a list of requirements here, right? So they're durable, capable of withstanding their exposed environment. So if you've got a really harsh environment, you want to make sure that you're selecting locks and devices that are going to stand up to that. They should be standardized within the facility with at least, either color, shape, size, and tags in print or in format. Substantial enough to prevent removal, so you don't want to be able to just go pull a lock off, and printed so that exposure conditions or wet, damp conditions won't cause the tag to deteriorate, and then it's substantial enough to prevent inadvertent removal. So these are just kind of key things to remember when you're looking at devices for your lockout tagout program. You want to make sure that you have those devices in place. You want to make sure that you have enough of them and that they're readily accessible to the teams that need them. So making sure they don't have to walk potentially all across the facility to get the devices they need. You want to make sure that these devices are accessible so that they can be used for lockout tagout procedures. So those are kind of the key elements of the program, with the exception of audits, which we're going to get into next, right? And that's really about maintaining your program. We work with a lot of customers in Lockout Tagout, and what sometimes can happen is the customer will make a significant investment in developing Lockout Tagout procedures, but then over time, as those procedures aren't audited, the program itself kind of falls into a state of disrepair. Because those procedures weren't audited and corrected, then it's really unclear as to which procedures are still accurate. And so this is why we want to go through that annual inspection. So annual inspection is required by the standard. The intent of it is to make sure that any errors, right, or any changes to the equipment are captured during that annual audit, and those procedures are updated so that you're always working with an accurate procedure for lockout tagout. That frequency is at least annually. So OSHA requires that those audits are done annually, but if you have a change to the machine, it's a good idea for you to check to make sure that that lockout tagout procedure hasn't changed as well. And then from a who does it, right? It's an authorized employee, other than the one the procedure is being used to inspect, right? So if you want somebody to kind of come take a look at it with fresh eyes and make sure that everything is accounted for on that procedure document. Employees also need to be audited. Typically, that's a representative sample of employees, and it's very similar to a procedure audit in that they're going to be kind of walking through the lockout tagout process for a piece of equipment that they're familiar with. And then documentation requirements. There are documentation requirements that go along with those audits. They should certify that the inspections have been conducted, and they should identify the machine or piece of equipment on which the energy control procedure is being utilized, the date of the inspection, the employees involved in that inspection, and the employee included in that inspection, and then the person performing the inspection. So those are the things that you're going to want to document when you go through that annual audit. So it's really important that those get done. It's really important that those get done and that they're well documented in case there's ever an issue. So execution of the audit, right, in terms of making this go very smoothly for your employees, it is a significant investment in time to perform those annual audits. You're going to want to make sure that everybody who's performing those audits has access to the documents, that they're able to manage those documents and changes. You may want to delegate depending on the size of your company. Sometimes the lockout tagout inspections fall to one person, but perhaps there's a way to delegate that responsibility more evenly across the employees that are able to do it, so that the burden is less on everyone than just a single person. And then it's important when you go through that documentation process to remember where everybody left off, right? So what audits have been done, what audits are in the what procedures are in the process of being updated, what audit tasks have already been completed, meaning I saw something that was incorrect on my procedure. It went into some sort of review phase to get corrected. And then once that procedure has been corrected and installed either at the point of use or wherever the procedures are kept, how does that get marked as completed, right? So you're not redoing work, right? So sometimes what we see is that there's sort of this double effort that comes on, that that happens because people don't have good documentation as to what's already been done and what still needs to do that. So just making sure that you have a good tracking and management system for where you are from an audit perspective, when those audits were completed, were they at the machine, who completed the audit, making sure you have access to all of that documentation as you perform. Those audits will not only keep you in compliance, but they'll make sure that the investment that you made when you created those initial procedures isn't lost, because you're in a place where you can make sure that those get updated to the latest machine configuration. Enhancing your program. And this can be a big topic. I'm not going to dive too deeply into this today. We're going to talk a lot about this when we get to the machine safety portion, which is the third webinar in our series. But there are ways to enhance your Lockout Tagout program to make sure that you're helping your employees perform lockout when it's necessary, and then taking advantage of minor servicing exceptions when that minor servicing exception applies. Oh. So the key things here, when you're talking about enhancing your program, you really want to get employee buy-in into your program. So what are the things that might affect employee buy-in to the program, right? You're going to look at things like employee engagement. You want to make sure that everybody feels like safety is their responsibility, understands why Lockout Tagout is really important, and just get the buy-in from the people that are executing those lockouts, so those authorized employees and then affected employees. Right, risk reduction is another way, right, when we look at talking about getting a buy-in to the program, right? Lockout Tagout is a documented way to reduce risk posed by equipment in the facility. And depending on how those Lockout Tagout procedures are written, we talked about making sure that they're efficient as possible. You might have cost savings associated with updating and maintaining your Lockout Tagout program, right? So if people can complete those that lockout procedure efficiently and also safely, there may be cost savings associated with less downtime. And once you maintain your program more efficiently, that leads to cost savings as well. So when we talk about the audit process, if you can get a really good process in place on those audits from a maintenance perspective, you can typically save between 50 and 85% of the time on audits by taking advantage of a couple things that might be available to you, right? So the next thing, right, when we talk about cost savings, right, another part of cost savings might be taking advantage of the minor servicing exception of the lockout standard. So when we talk about minor servicing exception, minor tool changes, adjustments, and other minor servicing activities, which are routine, repetitive, and integral to the use of the equipment for production. An alternative method can be used provided alternative effective protection is provided, right? So this minor servicing exception allows you to do things like a minor tool change, potentially something like clearing a jam. So you can use another alternative method for protection in lieu of Lockout Tagout, provided it meets it's part of the minor servicing exception. And that can actually save you quite a bit of time, right? So if we look at this procedure here, right, let's just say that this Lockout Tagout procedure takes 5 to 6 minutes. And let's say in this case, what you're doing is a minor tool change over here, but I've been able to implement some alternative method of protection that's as effective as Lockout Tagout, but I don't have to fully lock out my piece of equipment, right? That using that alternative method might take me a minute to put the machine in a safe state, I can make my tool change and get back up and running, versus the 5 to 6 minutes it would take me to fully lock out that piece of equipment. The other thing that's really key here about using using alternative de-energization procedures or alternative methods of protection is that they're really complementary to an effective lockout program. If you can get employee buy-in to do lockout tagout when it's necessary, and also support your employees by giving them alternative protection measures for things that would be covered under the minor servicing exception, they're able to keep production going smoothly where possible, and then they'll be more likely to use their lockout procedures when it's necessary. So really taking advantage of that minor servicing exception, putting alternative protection methods in place so that your employees can execute those minor servicing tasks without full lockout is a really great way to get buy-in on your full program because it's enhancing their ability to get their jobs done. So that's a really key point for enhancing your program. Oh, that's I don't know why that's in here. Hang on a second. I had a snafu. That's a double. So we want to talk about next is developing your program. That's kind of the last part. We've run through some key ways, or run through the requirements of a program, and we've run through some ways to maintain it and enhance it. So now what I wanted to talk about, if you're in the position where you're just starting, trying to get your lockout tagout program off the ground, what are some things that you can think about as you develop your program so that it gets developed and is maintained, is sustainable over time, right? So the key thing here is to simplify and standardize, right? So procedure content, right? We talked about the requirements for the procedures, and we also went through a couple of example types of procedures, like the way that they're written and organized, right? So you want to make sure that the procedure content is there, but you also want to make sure that you're considering things like best practices, right? So what is going to be the most efficient way for my teams to use these lockout procedures, right? How can I get buy-in from the other stakeholders in the organization, right? Be that maintenance, operators, et cetera, to make sure that my, to make sure that I'm developing a program that's useful for everybody, right? So making sure that we've taken into account the end user, right? How are they easy to use? Are they convenient? Do they have useful information, right? We saw that procedure that had at the beginning that had quite a bit of content in it. Is that useful for your teams, right? Making sure that you're kind of talking about the information and what's going on that procedure and how they'd like to see it and what's important and helpful for them to see is really important as you start to get your program off the ground. And then you also have considerations around the time it takes to gather that information and create procedures, right? So we saw that at the beginning, we saw that sort of simplest form, which is kind of a check the box and fill in some information. That's probably pretty straightforward in terms of a data gathering perspective, but maybe missing some of the helpful content that might be available to them if they had a graphical procedure. When we talk about that procedure with information surplus again, right, think about the time that would be required to gather that information before starting down that path. I've had customers ask me, in this case, it was a newer facility, and they were saying, well, hey, can you take pictures of everything in the off position so that the employees really know what that off position looks like for this particular isolation point. And there was a lot of discussion, right, that went back and forth into that, right? I can see how potentially that information might be helpful. However, if the way that you train your employees is to rely on how the off position looks in that procedure, are you willing to maintain that for every procedure you create moving forward? It makes sense now because you're not quite up and running from a production perspective, but will it make sense 5 years from now when you're creating a procedure for a piece of equipment that's already in production? Are you going to be able to take these machines down as you create those procedures to get those pictures? And if that doesn't happen, and the other 500 procedures in the facility are all in the off position and this one isn't, right? What's the potential for that to create a hazard? And so those are the kinds of things that you want to look at when you're thinking about what kind of information goes in there. And then you want to make a decision on that and stick with it so that the information that you're giving in those lockout procedures is consistent on each one of them. We talked a lot about these procedure preferences in the last slide, but really, how is it that you want to capture this information for your team? What do you have the bandwidth to create in terms of the time? And then how, do you have the bandwidth to do that consistently across all of your procedures? And then let's talk for a little bit, right? Once we've talked about some of the concepts that we want, but what are the teams that you might want to put in place in order to really effectively get your lockout tagout program across or up and running, right? So a program owner, right? That might be someone at the facility who's in environmental health and safety. That might be somebody who's at corporate, could be a plant manager, somebody in production, who might be the expert, right? That might be somebody in EHS, but it might also be someone else on the staff. Is there a machine expert, right? Somebody who knows the machine really well and understands where the isolation points are and what the typical approach is for them to lock it out, so that you're creating procedures that are useful to the teams, right? Who's the end user, right? It could be maintenance, could be an operator, potentially a contractor. If you have contractors coming in to perform maintenance, so you want to make sure that you're considering them. Who will be the creator of these procedures, right? That could involve many people, right? EHS, maintenance, operators, and then who's going to approve those procedures and make sure that they're accurate, right? Is there someone who can manage that sort of approver and quality check step on all of your procedures? And again, this team, right? Multiple people can fill these roles, right? Whether that's whether that's you as an EHS individual, you might play multiple roles on this team. So you can really make it as large or small as you want, but really you just want to make sure that you're thinking about all of the stakeholders as you create this team, but you want to make sure that you've got all of these roles identified as you go ahead and create your lockout program. And then with those, right, after you determine your teams, right, you're going to want to set out what your goals are, right? Awareness, any best practices that any of the teams have seen or what they'd like to see, right? And then determine the scope and capabilities. And then what we want to do is finalize that procedure format. That's really key. Before anyone can get to work on that, we want to make sure that that format is finalized. It's one of the first things that we do with customers is getting buy-in from all the key stakeholders on what the procedure format should look like. And that's really important because once you lock that in, then there's potentially more than one person that can go out and start creating these procedures. But if you haven't finalized that format, you're going to get an inconsistent procedure format across the facility. So that's one of the first steps that you're going to want to do. You want to make sure that you're dividing up responsibilities and determine a timeline. It is a significant, like we've talked about, it's a significant investment in time for your teams to build these procedures. So you want to make sure that you're dividing out the responsibilities over a reasonable set of people if possible. And then you're also going to want to determine the timeline for which these tasks should get done, right? Without appropriate timelines, right? You know, the projects can slip. So you want to determine that timeline and be realistic with the roles that these individuals play within the facility and how much they can realistically get done. But make sure that that timeline is in place so that your lockout program doesn't kind of fall by the wayside just as you're trying to get it off the ground, right? Then from there, create and implement those procedures, right? So go through that procedure creation process, make sure you've got that format in place. So now it's really about identifying the key machine-specific requirements that you're going to put into those procedures. So you want to go ahead and develop those procedures and then complete the training, complete the program with training, policy, and devices, right? So devices are really the last step. After you've created all of your procedures, you can review them to determine how many of each particular type of lock and device you might need, where you'd want to put them in the facility, how people can access them. And then you're going to want to make sure that your policy is up to date. It's got all of the key elements, means of enforcement, right? So you've just spent a significant investment in creating these procedures, right? How do you make sure that they're used? And then training. How do you make sure, right? How are you training your authorized and affected employees? If you are in a facility that has high turnover rate, you know, how do you make sure that you're training those new incoming employees and making sure that you've got a good good procedures in place around training of authorized and affected employees. And so that's really kind of what rounds out completing that program. But first, you want to make sure you're filling out your team, defining those goals, finalizing what that procedure format's going to look like, developing those procedures, and then closing it out. And then over time, you know, at least within, you know, the next year, you're going to want to take a look at your audit and kind of fill out that audit team and divide up those responsibilities. Make sure you've got the right format for keeping track of all of your audits. And then make sure you're completing that with any refresher training that you might need, making sure you're updating your procedures for any deficiencies that were found in the audit, and then closing those out. So that is the end of my presentation, and we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. So I wanted to open the floor up to anybody that has any questions for me, or certainly if there's something that you wanted to follow up on outside of a private audience, I'm certainly available for further discussions.
Nuala, I don't see anything in the chat either.
Okay, I will just wait up here a couple minutes. Okay, with that, I think we can close out our discussion today. Thanks for attending. And if you come up with any questions as you think about the content, feel free to reach out to the team at HESCO and they can get in touch with me. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.